Hey, listener. Ready to dive into something kind of different today? We're going deep on trust, but not the way you might think. No stuffy textbooks for us. Our source, get this. It's a hilarious monologue. Just this stream of consciousness thing bursting with stories and thoughts on trust.
It's a nice change of pace, right?
Yeah.
Instead of those abstract definitions, we see trust playing out in real life.
Yeah.
The messiness of it all.
Yeah. And me. I'm all about a good story. What really grabbed me is how the speaker starts off. It's about the vulnerability of trusting someone. They give these super funny examples, like someone going through your fridge to check the chews or making themselves way too comfy at your place.
It's funny because we've all been there, but it's more than just funny.
Yeah.
Those little things actually point to something big. Reciprocity. When we trust someone, we open ourselves up, hoping they won't,
Take advantage.
It's like giving someone a loaded gun and praying they know how to use it safely.
Whoa. That's a powerful way to put it. And the speaker doesn't shy away from what can go wrong with trust either. They've got stories about friends borrowing clothes and never returning them, people taking advantage of generosity, even situations where trust is well abused. Makes you think about times you've been too trusting, maybe a little naive.
Right.
Right?
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And those experiences, they can sting, leaving you feeling betrayed, hurt, even hesitant to trust again. What's interesting is the speaker doesn't just tell these stories as warnings. They also look at what happens when trust becomes overconfidence.
Oh, yeah. The confi versus confianza bit. I loved that. So insightful. And of course, hilarious. They talk about this guy at a Christmas party. He's so sure of himself. He's giving everyone fashion advice, even tries to fix people's hats. It's so awkward, but it shows how some people just don't get social cues.
Yeah.
No sense of boundaries.
Makes you wonder what's going on in their heads, right? Are they just clueless about how they come across?
Yeah.
Or is there something deeper, like a need to be in control? Maybe even a need for validation. Adding a little psychology to this could really help us understand it better.
Totally agree. And speaking of psychology, the speaker also gets into the emotional damage of betrayal. They tell the story about a friend who lost a bunch of money trusting the wrong person.
That one's heartbreaking. It brings up this idea of social capital. You see, trust isn't just about one-on-one relationships. It's what holds communities together. When trust breaks down, it has ripple effects. It weakens society, makes people less likely to help each other out.
Hold on, let's break that down a bit. Social capital, what is it exactly? And how's it connected to trust?
It's a cool concept. Think of it as how much trust, reciprocity, shared values exist in a community. High social capital. People cooperate more, volunteer, engage in their community because they believe in the system and each other. But when trust is low, social capital goes down, leading to isolation, suspicion, even more crime. It shows how trust has consequences that reach way beyond just individuals.
That's really interesting. So the speaker is pushing us to think about trust on different levels. Personal, interpersonal, even societal. But they also talk about how culture plays a role. A lot of their stories have Dominican slang and expressions. Makes you wonder how cultural norms affect how we see trust.
You're right on the money there. What might be considered rude or nosy in one culture could be totally normal in another, like giving advice without being asked or offering to help. In some cultures, that shows you care. In others, it's seen as meddling or disrespectful. Getting these cultural differences is key for navigating trust in different settings.
Totally. So it's not just about hard and fast rules. It's about context intention.
Yeah.
And being sensitive to cultural norms. It sounds like we need a more nuanced view of trust, recognizing it's not one size fits all.
Exactly. And that's where the speaker's approach really shines.
Yeah.
By sharing personal stories, they're inviting us to look at our own experiences with trust, challenging us to think critically about where we place our trust and how we deal with how complicated it is.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to our lives, asking us to think about past choices and how we might approach trust differently in the future. And that brings us to a big question. How do we find that balance between being trusting and being cautious? Between opening up and protecting ourselves?
Now that's the million-dollar question. And it's one we'll keep digging into in part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned as we explore more of the speaker's insights, often hilarious observations, uncovering practical ways to navigate the tricky world of trust. Welcome back to our Trust Deep Dive. I'm really excited to keep going with these stories and see what else we can find.
Me too. As we go deeper into these stories, I'm noticing how often the speaker uses humor to show those moments where trust, or maybe misplaced confidence, creates these super awkward situations. Like that story about the guy showing up at his friend's for dinner with a +1 uninvited.
Oh yeah, that one's a classic. It's funny. But when you think about it, it brings up questions about social awareness and the assumptions we make in relationships. Did the guy actually think his friend wouldn't mind? Or was it a case of conflict, that overconfidence where you don't see boundaries?
It's a perfect example of how what we think is okay can totally clash with reality. And sometimes those clashes have real consequences. Like in that story about the friend borrowing clothes and then keeping them forever, acting like they owned them.
That makes me think of psychological ownership. It's this idea that when we use something a lot, even if it isn't ours, we start feeling like it's ours, like we get attached and it's hard to let go.
So maybe the friend who borrowed the clothes, they didn't even realize they were crossing a line. It might have felt like those clothes were part of their wardrobe.
Exactly. And that's where talking to each other is so important. If the friend who lent the clothes had said something like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, or can you return them by this date, it might have stopped things from getting out of hand. But we often don't speak up, especially with close friends. We don't want to risk the friendship.
It's tough finding that balance between being generous and trusting, but also protecting ourselves. And it's not just clothes or stuff, right? This speaker has some crazy stories about people borrowing cars without asking, even renting them out to strangers.
Those are wild. They show a different side of trust, the responsibility that comes with it. When someone trusts us with something important, whether it's something they own or a secret, we have to honor that trust and be responsible.
For sure. That leads to another theme in these stories. Social intelligence and how it helps us navigate trust. The speaker tells this funny story about a guy who invites himself on his friend's family vacation, totally clueless about how awkward and uncomfortable it could be.
Oof, that one made me cringe. It's like textbook, what happens when we misread social cues or don't think about other people's perspectives. This guy thought he was closer to his friend than he actually was. Big time social blunder.
And then there's the woman who tries on her friend's clothes without asking. Talk about a boundary violation.
It's interesting because in some cultures, that might be totally fine, even a sign of closeness. But in others, it would be a huge invasion of privacy. It just goes to show how important it is to get cultural differences and to be clear about our boundaries, especially when we're with people from different backgrounds.
You know, listening to these stories, I'm realizing that trust isn't just about believing people are good. It's also about understanding how people are, knowing that people are complicated and sometimes mess up, even close friends.
That's a really important point. Trusting wisely means understanding that people can have good or bad intentions. It's about developing that ability to see red flags and assess risks while still being open to connecting with people.
So it's not about being cynical or distrusting everyone. It's about having a deeper understanding of trust. Knowing it's not always black and white, there are shades of gray. Different levels of trust we give depending on the relationship and the situation.
Exactly. And the speaker stories give us a guide for navigating those gray areas. They show us what can go wrong with blind faith, the importance of boundaries, and the power of clear communication to build and keep healthy relationships.
It's like they're giving us a crash course on Trust 101, teaching us valuable lessons through these funny and relatable stories.
And speaking of lessons, the speaker also touches on a darker side of trust. Manipulation. They tell a story about a guy who uses his friend's name to sneak into a restricted area at a game.
Oh, right. That's classic. Someone taking advantage of trust for their own benefit. It makes me think, how can we protect ourselves from people who might try to use or manipulate us?
That's a really important question, and one we'll dig into more in the last part of our deep dive. Stick around as we explore ways to protect trust and build resilience when faced with potential betrayal.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into trust. We've covered so much. From how vulnerable trusting someone makes us, to how overconfidence can backfire.
We've laughed. We've cringed. Maybe even seen ourselves in some of those hilarious stories. But under all the humor, there's a lot of wisdom about how trust works in our lives.
Right. And in this last part, I'm really interested in how we can protect trust, especially in a world where it feels like manipulation and betrayal are everywhere.
It's a good question. And the speaker actually gives some good advice. Remember that story about the mechanic who took his client's car for a joyride?
Yeah.
That wasn't just a bad call. It was breaking a professional code, violating the trust the client put in him.
Yeah, it makes you think about how important it is to do your research, especially when dealing with people who are supposed to be experts. We can't just trust everyone blindly, can we?
No way.
Yeah.
Trust has to be earned. And it's smart to be careful, especially when it comes to things that could affect our safety or money. It doesn't mean we should be suspicious of everyone, but we should be a little skeptical. Get some information before we make big decisions.
So instead of just handing over our car keys, maybe we should check online reviews, ask for recommendations, or even get a second opinion before we let someone do a big repair.
Exactly. It's about being informed and taking action, not just to protect ourselves, but to make sure we're putting our trust in the right people.
And it's not just about work relationships, is it? A lot of the speaker's stories are about friends and personal stuff, where boundaries get crossed, assumptions get made, and trust is sometimes taken advantage of.
True. And in those situations, talking to each other clearly is really important.
Yeah.
The speaker keeps bringing this up with stories of people feeling pressured to lend money, share personal things, or even have people over they don't want there, all because they're afraid to say no.
It's like they're stuck in this people-pleasing cycle, afraid to set boundaries because they don't want to damage the relationship. But as we've seen, not setting boundaries can actually lead to resentment, and that erodes trust over time.
You got it. Learning to say no, nicely but firmly, is super important to protect our time, energy, and our feelings. It's not about being selfish. It's about respecting our own needs and limits.
Yeah.
Real friends will respect our boundaries, even if they don't always agree.
And if they don't, maybe that's a sign that the friendship isn't as good as we thought. It's hard to accept, but sometimes the best way to protect ourselves is to walk away from a relationship that's draining or disrespectful.
It's about realizing that we have the power to choose who we let into our lives and to set the rules for those relationships. Trust shouldn't feel like a weight or make us anxious. It should make us feel stronger and happier.
That's so true. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key things our listeners can take away and use in their lives? What can they do to build healthy trust and stay safe?
I think the most important thing is being discerning. Don't just trust anyone you meet. Get some information. Watch how they act. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Make sure everyone's on the same page. And set boundaries. Clear communication is so important for building strong, healthy relationships.
And remember, trust goes both ways. It's not just about what others do for us. It's about how we treat them. Are we reliable? Do we respect their boundaries? Do we keep our promises? Building trust takes consistent effort and honesty from both sides.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves, it's about being trustworthy people who create strong reciprocal relationships.
You nailed it. And lastly, don't be afraid to let go of relationships that aren't good for you anymore. Sometimes, walking away is the healthiest and most empowering thing you can do.
That's such a good point. It reminds us that we have the power to shape our own lives and to surround ourselves with people who lift us up and support us.
And remember, building trust takes time. It's a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs. Mistakes will happen, and trust might get broken. But what matters is that we learn from those experiences, forgive when we can, and keep moving forward with an open heart and a smart mind.
This has been an amazing journey, hasn't it? We've learned so much about how complicated trust is, how it can bring people together, and how it can cause pain. But in the end, I think the message is hopeful. Trust is essential for human connection. And while it takes effort and attention, it's something worth working for, something that makes our lives richer in so many ways.
I totally agree. And with that, we've come to the end of our deep dive into trust. We hope you've got some new things to think about, a few laughs, and maybe a new appreciation for that delicate but powerful force that connects us all.